Well, I love my wife. She's incredible.
Yeah.
A great mother.
Yeah.
The kids are healthy and happy, and of course, there's nothing more than that.
Richard Gere had it all: fame, fortune, and the world at his feet. Then, without warning, he gave it all up. He sold his mansions, vanished from Hollywood, and moved to a quiet corner of Spain. No farewell, no scandal, just silence. But behind that silence is a life so unexpected, it's left fans in shock, from secret wine cellars to rescue missions at sea, and fatherhood at 70.
If you put the mirror up to your life, you say, it's not true. That's not the way it is. It doesn't make me depressed. It actually makes me smile in a way because you recognize the truth of it.
What is Richard Gere really holding on to? And why does the fortune he left behind bring people to tears? Let's discover. The heartthrob that Hollywood built. He had the face of a movie star, the voice of a poet, and the kind of presence that made entire rooms go silent. Richard Gere didn't just arrive in Hollywood, he took over. And for 2 decades, it seemed like nothing could touch him. He made women swoon, directors line up, and studios richer with every release. But behind the tailored suits and red carpet smiles, something quietly began to break. What if the man who had it all never wanted any of it? What if he spent his whole career preparing to walk away from everything? And what if the fortune he left behind says more about who he truly is than any role ever did? Richard Gere was born on August 31st, 1949, in a quiet town near Syracuse, New York. There were no movie cameras in his childhood. His father sold insurance. His mother was a homemaker. The family wasn't rich, but they were grounded. Their home was filled with music, discipline, and long conversations about right and wrong. From a young age, Gere stood out, not for being loud or charming, but for being curious. He played the trumpet. He trained in gymnastics. He read philosophy. And when he landed a scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 1967, he chose to study 2 things that don't usually lead to Hollywood stardom: philosophy and theater. But Gere wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing understanding of people, of purpose, of himself. After 2 years, he dropped out, not because he was failing, but because he didn't believe a diploma was necessary to live a life of meaning. He moved to New York, then Seattle. He joined small theater productions, lived on little, and auditioned endlessly. He wasn't charming in the way casting directors expected, but that was the secret. He didn't need to act like a star. He already was one, with a stillness and intensity that made you look twice. That raw magnetism came through in The Killer's Head, a play where he performed blindfolded. No face, no body language, just voice, just presence. But it was 1980 that changed everything. John Travolta had just turned down a controversial film about a high-end escort in Los Angeles. The role was risky, provocative. No one knew if audiences were ready. Then came Gere. American Gigolo wasn't just a hit. It made him an icon. In that film, he stripped down everything, literally and emotionally. He didn't play a man trying to be seductive. He was seductive, but also mysterious, distant, complicated. Suddenly, Gere wasn't just a promising actor. He was the face of a new kind of leading man. Less talk, more presence. Less ego, more enigma. Over the next decade, Richard Gere became the man everyone in Hollywood wanted. Directors wanted him for his silence. Studios wanted him for his profitability. Fans wanted him because he seemed untouchable. With An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982, Gere cemented himself as a romantic lead, who could also carry dramatic weight. And then came Pretty Woman in 1990, a film he almost didn't take because the script felt too light, too corny. It was only after meeting Julia Roberts and feeling an electric, unexplainable chemistry that he agreed. The result? $463 million at the global box office. A fairy tale for the masses. A pop culture phenomenon. Behind the scenes, Gere was just as fascinating. He dated high-profile women, Cindy Crawford, Priscilla Presley, and later Carrie Lowell, but never paraded his relationships. He walked red carpets with quiet poise, not flashy bravado. His looks were classic, but his demeanor was different. He was never the party guy, never the loud celebrity. Even at the peak of his fame, he carried himself like someone watching it all from a distance. Hollywood, of course, saw him as a product, and a profitable one. In the 90s, he was earning $2 million, $5 million, then up to $13 million per film. But Gere wasn't playing the game the way others did. While his peers chased franchises, he took on roles that were darker, edgier, riskier. In Internal Affairs, 1990, he played a deeply corrupt cop. In Primal Fear, 1996, he squared off against a manipulative teenage killer, helping launch Edward Norton's career in the process. In The Jackal, 1997, he played an IRA soldier with an Irish accent. Not exactly easy box office choices. Gere had the fame, the looks, and the bank account. But he also had something Hollywood didn't know how to handle: a moral compass. As studios turned away from his activism, he quietly stepped back. The red carpets, the roles, the wealth. It was all just a costume. He once called Hollywood temporary. So what was permanent? And when he walked away from it all, what was he really walking toward? The vanishing, real estate sales, Spanish retreats, and Goya shock. In one of the most shocking developments in recent celebrity history, Richard Gere has quietly erased himself from America. Between 2022 and 2024, the iconic actor sold nearly every piece of property he owned in the United States: multi-million-dollar estates, luxury hotels, homes he'd kept for decades, gone. Not downsized, not repurposed, sold, emptied, wiped clean. There were no public statements, no goodbye tours, no social media updates. It was as if he was closing chapters behind locked doors and walking away with the keys in his pocket. Why would one of Hollywood's richest and most beloved stars, now worth over $120 million, abandon everything he had built in the country that made him famous? And why is he now hiding in plain sight, in a quiet suburb north of Madrid? Let's start with the facts. In the late 80s, as his career skyrocketed, Richard Gere purchased a sprawling estate in Pound Ridge, New York. It wasn't flashy like Beverly Hills. It was quiet, green, wooded, private. Over the years, he expanded the property to over 50 acres, adding guest houses, horse stables, ponds, gardens, and forest trails. It became his retreat, his sanctuary, and his home for more than 3 decades. This wasn't just another celebrity estate. This was the place Gere called his own. But in 2022, out of nowhere, he listed it. The price? $28 million. The listing stunned fans and media alike. And when it sold, without press, without fanfare, it felt like something more than just a real estate deal. It felt like a statement. Soon after, the dominoes fell. The Bedford Post Inn, a boutique hotel and yoga center he'd lovingly restored with his own hands, was let go. Gere had spent years turning that property into a reflection of his values: organic food, meditation rooms, No bar, no VIP culture, just peace. The kind of place that told you more about who Richard Gere really was than any interview. That too he walked away from. Then came the Southampton house, a beachside luxury property he bought for $6.5 million and later sold for $36 million. He'd held on to it for years, quietly enjoying its seclusion. But just like the others, it was sold off, quickly and cleanly. Even his long-held apartment in Manhattan's Gramercy Park, recommended to him by Jimmy Fallon, was listed, and a more modest unit, where he'd once lived for 2 decades, was quietly turned into a luxury rental at $20,000 a month. Everything was changing. Or rather, everything was gone. And then came the twist no one saw coming. In early 2025, Richard Gere reappeared, but not in Los Angeles or New York. He was standing on stage in Granada, Spain, accepting the Goya Internacional Award, Spain's highest cinematic honor. He looked calm, smiling, healthy, dressed in a classic black tuxedo. And yet, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. This was not just a celebration of his past. It was the clearest signal yet that Gere was making Spain his future. The Goya Award, given by Spain's Academy of Cinematographic Arts and Sciences, is rarely handed to non-Spanish actors. It's not a casual invitation, it's an embrace. A recognition that Gere's career, and more importantly his values, resonate beyond American screens. But what really caught attention wasn't just his win, it was what went wrong during his speech. Gere spoke earnestly about compassion, about art, about the need to come together in times of division. But when Spanish TV aired the moment, the subtitles were riddled with errors, mistranslations, omissions, and confusing phrasing that distorted the tone of his message. Spanish media and audiences immediately criticized the quality of the subtitles, with some saying they undermined the meaning of his heartfelt words. It sparked an online debate. Had Gere been disrespected? Or was it just another example of how easily sincerity can be lost in translation? Either way, the moment had impact. Gere wasn't just in Spain. He was being honored by it, seen, welcomed, not as a nostalgic symbol of a bygone Hollywood era, but as someone relevant now, even without a blockbuster release. And this wasn't a one-off visit. Gere now lives in Alcobendas, a quiet suburb north of Madrid. The villa he purchased spans 34 acres. It has horse stables, a wine cellar, a sprawling garden, and room for his 2 young sons to play freely. No helicopters, no armed security, no paparazzi barricades. Just a man, his family, and a slower rhythm of life. But why Alcobendas? Why not Paris, or Rome, or London? The answer lies in Gere's wife, Alejandra Silva, a Spanish publicist, social activist, and the daughter of a former vice president of Real Madrid Football Club. Alejandra's family roots are in Spain. Gere once told Vanity Fair Spain, "My wife gave me 6 years to live in my world. Now it's time I live in hers." And he meant it. This wasn't a temporary relocation. This was a complete reset. A new home, a new culture, a new definition of what life should look like in his 70s. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. In late 2024, Alejandra revealed in interviews that while the family is content in Spain, they do plan to return to the United States in a few years. Not permanently, but part-time, to find a balance between both worlds. But still, the emotional center of their lives has clearly shifted. For now, Richard Gere is not an American actor living abroad. He's a man who's left the country that defined him to rebuild his life somewhere quieter, slower, and more meaningful. And here's the part many forget. Gere didn't stop working. In 2024, he starred in Longing, a drama directed by Israeli filmmaker Savi Gabazon. It was a remake of Gabazon's own award-winning film, and Gere took on the role of a man unraveling emotionally after discovering he had a child he never knew existed. The film received mixed reviews. Some praised its ambition, others criticized its pacing, but what stood out was Gere's continued willingness to take risks. Even after everything, he still acts. He still creates. He just doesn't do it for headlines anymore. Banned, blacklisted, and silenced. Hollywood's revenge? In 1993, under the lights of the Oscars stage and in front of millions of viewers worldwide, Richard Gere did something that changed the course of his career forever. Instead of reading the teleprompter and thanking producers like every other presenter, he made a sharp detour. While introducing the nominees for Best Art Direction, he took a moment to speak, plainly and fearlessly, about something that had nothing to do with the film industry. He condemned China's occupation of Tibet and called for the Chinese government to end its mistreatment. What followed wasn't applause. It was silence. Not in the room, but in the months and years that came after. Richard Gere wasn't reprimanded publicly. No fines, no headlines, just fewer phone calls. Projects that were supposed to move forward stalled. Roles that seemed like a sure thing quietly went to someone else. And slowly, invisibly, the industry that had once celebrated him began to lock him out. Not for box office failure, not for scandal, but for political inconvenience. In the decades that followed, Gere confirmed it himself. He had been blacklisted. Not officially, not in writing, but in practice. There are definitely movies that I can't be in because the Chinese will say, "Not with him," he said in an interview. It wasn't hard to trace the shift. The 90s had been a high point, but after his Oscar speech, his presence in major studio films began to dwindle. He didn't stop working, but the budgets were smaller, the platforms quieter, and most importantly, the studios no longer came calling. Why would Hollywood do this? Why would an actor with global recognition, critical respect, and a string of box office hits be cast aside? The answer lies in one word: China. Since the early 2000s, China has grown into one of the most lucrative film markets in the world. Big-budget Hollywood films routinely make hundreds of millions of dollars in Chinese theaters. But there's a catch. For a film to be released in China, it must be approved by the country's National Radio and Television Administration, a state-run agency that monitors content. If a film, actor, or director is seen as politically sensitive, it can be blocked entirely from release. This approval system has effectively given China the power to decide what the world sees, and more importantly, who gets to be seen. As a result, studios began to avoid anything that might offend Chinese officials, including actors who had criticized the regime. Richard Gere was at the top of that list. To Hollywood, the math was simple. One actor, no matter how talented or respected, wasn't worth losing access to the Chinese market. Gere became what industry insiders call radioactive, not because of anything he did in private, but because of what he said in public. And he never backed down to it. He didn't issue an apology. He didn't explain it away. He doubled down on his beliefs. He continued to speak out for Tibetan independence, attend rallies, meet with the Dalai Lama, and chair the board of the International Campaign for Tibet. While other celebrities built brands, Richard Gere built alliances that had nothing to do with image, and everything to do with principle. In fact, his activism didn't stop at Tibet. He helped found an HIV/AIDS charity in India, lobbied for the rights of indigenous tribes through Survival International, and frequently used his platform to speak out against war, poverty, and environmental destruction. But it was Tibet that drew the sharpest consequences. And here's the irony that few people talk about. Hollywood, the industry that prides itself on freedom of expression, effectively silenced one of its own, not because of what he did, but because of who he upset. In an age when personal scandals can be spun into PR comebacks, Gere wasn't cancelled for disgrace. He was erased for telling the truth. This wasn't exile in the classic sense. There was no formal decree, no blacklist document. It was something more subtle and therefore more powerful, a closed door that no one admitted was closed. He was still working, just not where it mattered. He moved to indie films, foreign productions, and festival circuits. These were still meaningful projects, but they didn't have the reach or prestige of the Hollywood machine. And that's what makes his story so strange and so unsettling. We live in a time when celebrities can bounce back from almost anything. Drug abuse, criminal charges, leaked videos, none of it is permanent. But speaking out against a global superpower? That's the kind of offense Hollywood doesn't forgive because it costs money. A lot of it. So here's the question no one wants to ask. Was Richard Gere pushed out of the industry not because he failed, but because he refused to be silent? And if so, what does that say about the values of an industry that claims to care about justice, equality, and freedom? The film world is full of stories about comebacks, but Gere never staged one, because he never needed to. He made peace with the shift. While studios were calculating their profits, he was calculating something else: impact, integrity, peace of mind. That's why he never fought to reclaim his spot at the top. He didn't want to be invited back to a table that had punished him for his values. And still, the silence from the industry is loud. Even after Chicago, his biggest late career success, he didn't receive an Oscar nomination. Even after critically praised performances in Arbitrage, Norman, and The Dinner, his name stayed off the Academy's shortlist. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because the invisible penalty was still in effect. Today, Richard Gere lives on his own terms. He doesn't attend most premieres. He doesn't chase screen time. He doesn't need the validation of a box office report. He's doing what very few celebrities dare to do: live according to his own beliefs, even if it costs him everything the industry once gave him. A monk in Armani. The spiritual awakening of Richard Gere. The man who once played polished millionaires on screen was, in private, devoting his life to Buddhist study, daily meditation, and the quiet discipline of self-awareness. Most people don't know that Richard Gere began practicing Buddhism in his early 20s. While most actors his age were learning how to network, Gere was sitting cross-legged in silence. He trained under Kyozan Joshu Sasaki, a Japanese Zen master who had established one of the first serious Zen training centers in the United States. Sasaki was known for his strictness, his intensity, and his emphasis on direct experience over intellectual understanding. Students didn't just read about enlightenment, they sat with it, sometimes for hours, in complete stillness. Gere took to it seriously. He wasn't a spiritual tourist. He was all in. This wasn't a passing phase. Gere spent years deepening his practice. He wasn't content to just read Zen quotes or meditate between film sets. He traveled to Nepal, studied under monks, and immersed himself in Buddhist teachings. Eventually, he encountered Tibetan Buddhism, a tradition that blends meditation with ritual, philosophy, and a deep commitment to compassion. He studied under the Dalai Lama, not just as a fan or a donor, but as a student. And in time, he was personally initiated into the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, the same lineage followed by the Dalai Lama himself. The connection between Gere and the Dalai Lama is not superficial. The two men have spent time together, both privately and publicly, over many years. Gere often refers to the Dalai Lama not just as a spiritual teacher, but as a moral compass for the modern world. He once described meeting him for the first time as feeling the sun had risen inside me. The Dalai Lama, in turn, has praised Gere's sincerity and commitment, not for his fame, but for his willingness to do the work quietly, without the need for credit. And that's a key distinction. Gere doesn't just practice Buddhism, he advocates for it. He chairs the International Campaign for Tibet, a non-profit that fights for religious freedom, education, and cultural preservation for Tibetan people living under Chinese rule. He has spoken before the United Nations, lobbied U.S. lawmakers, and used his platform to shine light on issues that most celebrities wouldn't dare touch. But he doesn't shout about it. He doesn't post about it for likes. He just does it, over and over again. So where does all that spiritual commitment show up in his life? Everywhere. Look at the homes he built. They weren't designed for parties, premieres, or guest lists. They were sanctuaries. In Pound Ridge, New York, Gere lived on a 50-acre estate surrounded by private riding trails, ponds, forests, and gardens. His house had 9 fireplaces, 5 guest houses, a wine cellar, and horse stables, but not for show. These weren't status symbols. They were pieces of a life that valued nature, solitude, and peace. The same goes for his Bedford Post Inn, which he purchased and renovated not to launch a hospitality brand, but to create a space for reflection. The inn became a boutique meditation center with yoga classes, organic meals, and absolutely no nightlife. No EDM, no bar, no celebrity culture, just stillness. His daily routines reflect that same ethic. Gere wakes early. He practices yoga. He meditates. He walks in silence. He gardens. And when he's with his children, he's fully there. Not distracted, not multitasking. Mindful parenting, for Gere, means being completely present in the moment. No phone in one hand and conversation in the other. Just presence. One of the most surprising things about Gere's life is how little he's attached to traditional rewards. He has never won an Oscar. In fact, he's rarely even been nominated. And yet, he never campaigned for one, never paid for Oscar ads, never joined the club of actors who lobby for votes. Why? Because awards have nothing to do with what he values. He once said in an interview that his goal isn't to entertain or impress. His goal is to live in alignment with his own values, even if it means becoming invisible to the world. Love, late fatherhood, and the woman who changed everything. For decades, Richard Gere was known as a lone figure in Hollywood. Not aloof, but private. Always on the edge of the crowd, never fully part of it. He was the romantic lead in Pretty Woman, the seductive force in American Gigolo, the quiet storm in An Officer and a Gentleman. But behind the camera, he seemed to walk alone. His relationships were few and far between. His interviews were carefully measured. He never flaunted his private life, and he rarely let the world in. That all changed in 2018. Her name is Alejandra Silva, a Spanish publicist and activist, more than 3 decades his junior. At the time, the pairing surprised many. Gere was in his late 60s, Silva was in her 30s, but what looked like a mismatch from the outside became something far more profound. Alejandra wasn't just a partner, she was a turning point. The woman who finally brought Richard Gere out of his quiet, solitary orbit and grounded him in something new: family. Silva, born into a prominent Spanish family, is the daughter of Ignacio Silva, a former vice president of Real Madrid Football Club. She grew up surrounded by influence, politics, sports, media, but chose a different path. She built a life around activism and social responsibility, focusing on homelessness and refugee rights. Before meeting Gere, she had already been involved with multiple nonprofit initiatives and led campaigns to support vulnerable communities in Spain and Latin America. She wasn't seeking celebrity. She was already living with purpose. Gere met her through mutual friends. Their bond wasn't built on image, but on values. Both were spiritual, politically engaged, and disinterested in fame. In 2015, they began dating. By 2018, they were married in a quiet civil ceremony in New York. No celebrity photographers, no branded magazine spreads. Just two people trying to build something real. The most astonishing part of their story, however, was yet to come. In 2019, at age 70, Richard Gere became a father again. His son, Alexander, was born in New York. 1 year later, in 2020, the couple welcomed their second child, another boy whose name has not been publicly disclosed. Becoming a father in his 70s wasn't part of any plan. Gere has said openly that it happened naturally, unexpectedly, but completely welcomed. And once it did, his priorities shifted immediately. This was not celebrity fatherhood. There were no nannies working around the clock, no staff managing the house while Gere disappeared to a film set. He decided early on that he wanted to be present. Not a symbolic presence, a real one. He walks his sons to school. He cooks. He gardens. He tells bedtime stories. He plays. His life now revolves around diaper changes, afternoon snacks, and preschool drawings. For a man once surrounded by stylists, assistants, and production teams, the choice was stark and deliberate. And that's where Gere's story begins to take a different shape. This isn't the aging actor who tries to recapture youth through younger partners or flashy reinventions. He didn't marry Silva to chase energy or prove relevance. He married her to slow down. He had spent over 4 decades in the public eye. Now, finally, he wanted to look inward and build something that had nothing to do with reputation. This wasn't about romance. It was about rooting himself in real life. In a recent interview with Vanity Fair Spain, Gere said something simple but revealing. "My wife gave me 6 years to live in my world. Now I live in hers." That sentence explains everything. He wasn't just sharing a home with Alejandra. He was sharing a world view, a language, a family, a way of life. When they moved full-time to Alcobendas, a quiet suburb north of Madrid, it wasn't a retirement. It was a restructuring. He stepped out of the spotlight not to disappear, but to finally live on his own terms. And the transition wasn't symbolic. Between 2022 and 2024, Gere sold nearly all of his U.S. properties. The Pound Ridge estate, the Bedford Post Inn, his Manhattan apartment, even the Southampton house that had once fetched $36 million. Gone. Every sale was quiet, clean, and purposeful. It was clear he wasn't coming back to the world he'd once ruled. Not in the same way. In December 2024, Richard and Alejandra hosted Christmas at their home in Alcobendas. It wasn't a glamorous affair. It was a family gathering, 35 relatives, multiple generations, a home filled with laughter and warmth. What made headlines wasn't the guest list. It was the tone. For the first time, Gere was no longer the solitary icon. He was the patriarch, the center of a sprawling, intergenerational family. The man who once played the mysterious lover had become a father figure in the truest sense. What happens when a man famous for keeping the world at arm's length finally lets it in? That's what makes this chapter in Gere's life so moving. He didn't just fall in love, he opened up in a way he never had before. And in doing so, he revealed something that many public figures try to hide. That real happiness often has nothing to do with acclaim or wealth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.